Ahoy hoy shippies. Sea battles in the Age of Sail are often seen as duels between cannon broadsides, but naval combat, especially between the smaller ships used by pirates and their targets, was much more dynamic. A lot of underrated weapon systems have therefore been somewhat forgotten. One example is the musket, which is often thought of as subordinate to the cutlass and pistol, relegated to a few sharpshooters, whereas historically it was used more broadly to pepper enemy crews in mass volleys, and even for destroying sails and rigging. But what if you could take the flexibility and potential of a musket volley and slap it into one single weapon, ready to be used by just one man? That would be the swivel gun. This was essentially the machine gun of a pirate ship. Most of them did not have any multi-shot or rapid-fire options, but much like how the musket had the same tactical application as a modern combat rifle, the swivel had the same tactical application as an MG: suppression and clearing large swaths of enemies. Loaded up with a swarm of cheap junk and fired like a giant shotgun, they were used to either prelude boarding attacks or to fend them off. A good shot could clear an entire rowboat of enemy boarders. It was used both defensively and offensively, and a favorite, cost-effective weapon of merchants and rovers alike. In the 19th century, the swivel was replaced by the Nordenfeldt volley gun, the Gatling, and finally, proper gas-operated machine guns. And I guess water hoses? The family line of these weapons is as clear as day. The swivel gun is a candidate for the oldest type of firearm ever brought aboard wooden ships. Those square holes cut into the sides of the ship, gun ports, were not invented until the 15th century, and sea artillery before then was limited to whatever you could fire over the railing. The earliest archaeological sample we have is the bouche à feu, mouth of fire, recovered from a late 14th century shipwreck in the Netherlands. It is a wide-bored, short-barreled piece of wrought iron, believed to have been mounted on a somewhat convoluted wooden stand. These sorts of stands have been depicted in medieval manuscripts from the early 15th century. Soon enough they developed the swivel gun, which would be used for the next 4 centuries. According to the earliest records from the Tower of London, most of the 14th century pieces were made of copper, and bronze would become a common material for high-quality swivel guns. Around the same time, wrought iron barrels were developed, similar to the bouche à feu. Unlike the copper and bronze barrels, the iron ones were not forged in one single piece. The blacksmith either hammered an iron sheet around a mandrel or grouped together a bunch of iron rods. Both of these bases were then reinforced with iron bands, while the base was red hot. They would literally hold the piece together. This was the standard form of the basic swivel gun up until the 19th century. Most iconically, the swivel gun earned its name from being mounted on a swiveling fork. The gun had trunnions, essentially 2 big buttons, forged into the middle or back of the gun, and these were placed into a crotch or fork, with the base of the fork placed into a socket drilled into a stanchion. A stanchion is a wooden pillar reinforced with iron bands, and placed on the outside of the ship's railing or some other tactical location, like the stern, bow, or the tops, platforms located halfway up the mast. The stanchion would absorb the recoil, which could otherwise damage the superstructure of the ship. Brass or copper swivel guns, on the other hand, were forged in a single piece. It was easy to work with, and if the gun blew up under pressure, either from flawed casting or from being overcharged, it tore instead of fragmented, posing less danger to the crew around it. It still had some drawbacks. Brass was more expensive than iron, overheated faster, and also wore out faster, even if a brass gun was easily recast. In the end, iron guns replaced heavy bronze cannons, but bronze remained common for swivel guns. Most of the bronze pieces were loaded from the front. You inserted a gunpowder charge, wadding, shot, and another wad, and rammed it home. A needle was then stuck through the touch hole to pierce the gunpowder charge. Priming powder poured down the hole, and the gun fired by touching the hole with a lit flame from a linstock, a horn stick with a lit matchcord curled around it. The back of the swivel was typically furnished with a tiller, which you held in one hand to direct it. Then you sighted along the barrel and ignited the gun with your other hand. In the late 18th century, swivel guns were fitted with a flintlock ignition system. Then you simply had to pull a cord and the gun fired. However, iron swivel guns and some Spanish and Portuguese brass pieces were typically loaded from the back, or breech. The back part of the round gun would terminate in a rectangular breech, in which a hole was cut, giving access to the barrel. In this square recess was found a removable block called a chamber, kinda shaped like a tankard. The chamber was fixed in place by an iron wedge. To load a breech loader, you knocked out the wedge with a wooden mallet. Don't worry, the wedge was usually connected to the swivel by a small chain and easy to retrieve. Then you took the handle of the block and removed it and inserted your shot directly into the barrel, just before where the block was placed. Then you filled the block with gunpowder, placed it back into the breech, locked it with the wedge, and hammered it shut with a mallet. It was then fired in the same way as the brass gun. This system allowed the swivel gun to be loaded rather rapidly, as fast as 3 shots a minute. One trick was to keep multiple blocks on hand, filled up with powder and ready to be loaded. If operated by a team of 2, they might be able to load and fire faster than the average musket man, and certainly quicker than a cannon. You might think that overheating would be an issue, but according to a French manual, the breech-loaded swivel overheated less, since it was ventilated both from the front and back. This doesn't mean that breech loading didn't have its drawbacks. For one, improper casting techniques meant that there was a lot of gas leakage during firing. This would impact the accuracy of the shot, but the shooter could also be hurt. It's not very fun to have hot gunpowder gas in your face. That sounds kinda wrong, do not try this at home. If the gases made the shooter close his eyes or turn away his face, the accuracy could also be affected. Aside from the ability of the shooter, accuracy was not an inherent issue for the swivel gun, since they were seldom loaded with a single bullet. Instead, you charged them with what was essentially a shotgun round, a bunch of musket balls, or even just a heap of scrap. Iron nails, pieces of junk, and small stones. That is the reason for their Spanish name, pedrero, meaning stone shooter. In French they were called pierriers, and in English, pareros. This usually referred to the breech-loading swivels, but swivels could go by a lot of different names. Originally and occasionally, they did have a specific meaning, but people often mixed them up because they were all basically the same, mounted on a railing and firing junk shot. These names included falconets, serpentines, drakes, rabinets, bases, culverins, sling pieces. Oh my. These names did not come out of nowhere. In the late Middle Ages, not all of these light artillery pieces were mounted on swiveling forks. One of the earliest firearms ever discovered is the Mörkö gun, a handgun found along the coast of Sweden. It had likely been used aboard a ship. The handguns had a hook below their muzzle for steadying against a castle rampart or ship's railing, and this system would continue to be used up until the end of the Renaissance. In the wreck of the Mary Rose were found hail shot pieces. These strange contraptions had rectangular bores and were loaded with iron dice. They were operated by a team of 2. One man steadied the hook against the railing and the other one fired. Essentially, it was a swivel gun without a swivel. Indeed, it was very common for medieval and Renaissance ships to have their castles, the raised sections in the front and back of the ship, be equipped with very light artillery, mounted on carriages. These pieces were mounted in these high sections because they had lower recoil and didn't risk capsizing the ship when fired. They were used for killing enemy crew. Heavier guns, ship killers, were mounted on the lower deck. It's basically the same principle as the shape of a bottle. By having the bottle be larger and heavier at the bottom, it remains stable. But if you would redistribute the weight to the top, it becomes unstable. Those small pieces had different names depending on their size. Smallest was the rabinet. It had a 1-inch bore, weighed 300 pounds, and fired a half-pound shot. The serpentine was slightly bigger, and the falconet slightly bigger yet. The fowler, mounted on a 2-wheeled carriage, fired a 6-pound shot. These small, carriage-mounted pieces came to an end with the evolution of ship design. The high castles were gradually removed in order to improve ship stability and sailing qualities, but this also removed the raised, secure positions to fire the smaller artillery from. However, by removing them from the carriages and placing them in swivels on stanchions along the railings, their firepower and tactical purpose could be retained. Other common names for the swivel gun, which were unrelated to its size, was base, sling or sling piece, chambers, and the ominous murderer. Base referred to the rail-mounted, breech-loaded swivel gun. Sling was an archaic word for the fork the piece was mounted on, and by extension meant a swivel gun. The name chamber came from the tankard used to load it from the breech, and could by extension mean the entire gun. Murderer, or murdering piece, referred to the same artillery, and the name came from their use in murdering enemy crew. Indeed, their primary purpose was anti-personnel, not sinking ships. Compared to a carriage gun, it was easier to aim a swivel. Up, down, left, right, high or low. You could aim low at enemies coming at you in a rowboat, or enemies up in the masts. The scattering projectiles were even decent at damaging enemy sails and rigging, a crucial component of pirate tactics, disabling the target. The swivel gun was flexible in that it could be placed in multiple parts of the ship. By placing them along the sides of the ship, they could be used in conjunction with a broadside to damage the enemy at close range, or to fend off boarders. At the aftercastle, they could target enemy officers stationed in the back. In the front of the ship, against enemies you were pursuing. Swivels were mounted in the tops of the masts, and from this vantage point you could fire down on the enemy decks. Merchants would deploy their swivels inside of the ship itself. If attacked by pirates, they would retreat to the raised sections in the fore and back of the vessel, fortified into shipboard bunkers. Here they would mount swivels for shooting at the boarding party coming onto their deck. The scattering load was deadly effective at this distance. Since the swivel was usually loaded with scattering junk, acquiring ammunition was very cost effective, something which appealed both to pirates and merchants. The rapid reload and flexibility made them a favorite weapon, and their ships were often mounted with as many swivels as carriage guns, sometimes even more. In 1745, a French privateering brig named Le Glorieux had 6 cannons and 8 swivels. Pirate Captain Edward Condon had a ship with 12 cannons and 12 swivels. The infamous Captain Kidd commanded at one point a 52-ton sloop, San Antonio, armed with 6 cannons, 8 patereros, and 10 brass bases, a very high ratio of swivel guns. Swivel guns could naturally be purchased, many often being quite old, as they could be used for several decades, and brass guns could be recast over and over. Pirates would also steal swivel guns, and it was common plunder since it was so easy to carry a swivel and fit them aboard their ship. If not, it could be plugged up, waxed, and stowed in the bottom of the hold as ballast. When a stanchion had been constructed, the swivel could then be taken out and placed. It was also common to recover swivels from sunken shipwrecks, at least the brass kind, since they preserved better underwater. The swivel gun was more flexible than a carriage gun, but it was less flexible than a musket. Musketeers could be deployed anywhere on the ship and aim wherever they wanted, and the musket could easily be brought ashore and on campaign. I've never encountered any instance of buccaneers bringing a swivel gun with them into the field. Though 2 or even a single strong man could surely carry a swivel, it would still be exceedingly heavy, and probably not worth it. The closest I can think of is swivel guns being mounted on smaller boats. They could be placed in the front of rowboats, and this might be useful to prelude a boarding attack, using the swivel to clear away enemies, even defending swivels. Muskets were also the key to countering swivel guns. A single good shot or a volley of shooters could take down the swivel shooter, and continuous fire on his position could keep other men from taking his post. Apart from the types of swivels discussed previously, there were a handful of other weapon systems that were somewhat similar, but still so distinct as to be classified as something else. The espingole was a large blunderbuss or musket, so heavy that it had to be placed on a fork in a ship's stanchion. These were used in the same way as swivels for shooting at enemy crew, but could only be loaded with a smaller charge. However, they are supplied with a lock, trigger, and shoulder stock, making them safer and more comfortable to aim and fire. Organs, or organ guns, were a bunch of gun barrels strapped together, usually fired all at once, sometimes in rapid succession. They are one of the oldest weapon systems, and illustrations often can be found in the same medieval manuals as the earliest swivels. Some medieval and early modern military forces even mounted them on rolling carriages, but pirates usually had them mounted on swivels. The barrels of the organ could either be mounted round in a circle, but most typical seems to have been to arrange them in a line. All of the breeches were connected so that they discharged all at once. As far as I know, these were primarily loaded from the front, and since each barrel had to be loaded individually, it must have been more time-consuming and annoying than the swivel. In a French manual, it mentions loading an organ quickly and without risk, which might refer to breech loading. My French is a bit rusty. The organ would also have produced a different shot pattern, which might have been preferred in certain situations, such as when firing at a line of enemies. Several organ guns of the 17th century have also been preserved here in Sweden. This one from Skokloster Castle features 3 stacked rows of 4 large barrels each, discharged by a giant wheelock mechanism. It is aimed using a shoulder stock and is mounted on a swiveling base. Another strange contraption is skottbalken, an organ gun from 1670. It features a long wooden stock terminated in a shoulder butt, with a furrow cut along the top of the stock. At the other end is a massive rectangular block, mounted with 16 barrels in a splayed configuration. A hook is mounted below the block for steadying the gun against a railing, much like the hail shot piece. It was used to repel boarders. The museum in which it is kept says that the gun was discharged with a slow match, and the space between the shoulder stock and barrels was meant to protect the shooter from the discharge. But I'm not entirely sure how it operated, if the gun was ignited from the back or at the block. Since it is so bulky and heavy, it is possible that it was operated by a 2-man team. One man steadied, shouldered and aimed, and the other one discharged. It is an interesting contraption regardless, and since we know that pirates used organ guns, but not what they looked like, it isn't impossible that they assembled something like this, or the French one shown previously. Signal guns were essentially small swivels used for, well, signaling. This was either done by firing a gunpowder charge or by shooting a signal flare. One of these pieces was found in the wreck of Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. An example of how they were used was documented by Ravenel de Lussan in 1687. We discovered 3 sail of ships. We presently fired a paterero to call in our canoes, who were ashore to take in water. The paterero could also have referred to a regular swivel gun, not a dedicated signaling piece, but it shows how they were used. Pirates never used the puckle gun. Well, no one basically did, but it's still worth a mention here due to its strangeness. Named after its inventor, James Puckle. I don't actually know if he was called James, it is just one of those very English names, so I presume that's what he was named. You can think of the puckle as a giant flintlock revolver. It consisted of a long barrel with a revolving chamber at its end, holding 6 cylinders, each one loaded with powder and shot. By cranking the handle at the back of the chamber, it would bring a new cylinder into position, after which the chamber was primed, the flintlock cocked, and the weapon fired by a lever. The chamber could then be removed and replaced with a loaded one. I imagine that you could get off 4 to 6 shots a minute with the puckle, maybe even less, meaning that it wasn't much faster than a breech-loaded swivel, though certainly safer, but many times more expensive. Indeed, the puckle gun was never produced in any significant quantity, and may never have seen actual combat usage. Its biggest quirk was that one of the crafted cylinders was designed to fire square bullets, said to be more effective against Muslims. Henry Every would have loved one of those. We've established a tendency for pirates to arm their ships with a lot of swivel guns. These weapons were highly visible, and their sheer visual presence was as effective a weapon as their actual firepower, by intimidating the enemy into surrendering. Merchants soon realized that they could deploy a similar trick, arm their ships with a lot of swivels to scare off potential attackers. The problem was that iron and brass was expensive, and merchants needed to cut costs in order to make a profit. However, wood was cheap, so the solution was to make so-called Quaker swivels. named after the pacifist branch of Protestantism. It was common enough for pirates and merchants to take wooden logs, paint them black, and maybe mount them on a crude carriage to look like a cannon from a distance. This didn't require much work, whereas Quaker swivels were quite intricate. Everything from the muzzle and tiller to trunnions and just every intricate detail of the swivel's profile was carved out, and then painted black to look like iron. Even though they required some work, the Quaker swivels were still more economical than carriage ones, since they took up less space and you didn't have to cut gun ports for them. The intimidating effect of Quakers was proven by Captain Callender of the brig Amelia in 1800. Off Gibraltar, the brig was attacked by French corsairs, who hoisted a red flag to signal their intent to board and take the American. However, it took them 2.5 hours to come close enough to make the Americans surrender, showing that they were afraid, or at least cautious. Callender wrote the following of his preparations. On the passage I made 14 wood guns, fitted waistcloths fore and aft, and had painted the brig as warlike as possible. Some captains became too reliant on their Quakers, and when push came to shove, were unable to defend themselves. In 1799, the American ship Reindeer was taken by the French off Martinique. The ship was equipped with 20 guns, 19 of which were wood. They were unable to defend themselves, and the ship taken. A more practical invention of the late 18th century was the swivel howitzer. A howitzer is a short-barreled cannon that typically fires explosive ammunition in an arc, similar to a mortar. By 1780, probably a decade or a few earlier, small and stubby howitzer barrels were mounted on swivels on merchant vessels. According to William Falconer's Maritime Dictionary of 1780, they fired explosive shells or scattering bullets at enemy boarding parties. On some occasions, these funny contraptions were found aboard naval ships, and they became common with the Navy of the United States. However, the swivel howitzer was somewhat hazardous. The short barrel made it faster to load, but the muzzle flash could more easily set fire to the ship's rigging, especially when mounted in the tops. Nor did it have an especially long range, but it should be noted that even though long-barreled swivels had a decent range when loaded with a single bullet, they were not accurate. Swivels were basically just used for short-range anti-personnel purposes. Swivel guns continued to be used for the rest of the Age of Sail, and they became very popular with the Navy and privateers of the nascent United States. When Benedict Arnold first assembled a small naval force in 1776, it consisted of 16 vessels, in total carrying 86 carriage guns and 160 swivels. One fascinating American invention is a repeating swivel gun from the early 19th century. It was used during the War of 1812 and the Barbary Wars, and the surviving model is nowadays kept in the Dutch Rijksmuseum. It consists of 7 barrels strapped together, aimed with a curved tiller and fired by a flintlock mechanism, triggered with a lanyard. Whilst the gun does have 7 barrels, it actually has 49 shots. How does that work? It's kind of like a Roman candle. Each barrel is loaded with 7 individual charges of powder and shot, and the bullets are pierced so that the spark continues to the charge behind them. The 49 bullets are fired in one single volley, with the 7 charges of the 7 barrels fired one at a time in a single succession. The gun was loaded from the muzzle, and the ramrod had markings on the side to measure the position of the charges. This weapon design can be dated back as early as 1782, to an American farmer out of all people. But inventing a rapid-fire swivel gun sounds like something an American farmer would do. Swivel guns were used on ships and land across the world until the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution came up with new weapons that supplanted them. The Nordenfeldt gun was a descendant of the organ gun, able to be rapidly loaded from the breech. The famous Gatling gun you probably know of. Nowadays, ship railings and defensive positions might be mounted with a machine gun of any caliber, up to the thundering 50 cal. In some cases, modern traders even use water hoses to repel pirates in small rubber boats. They are all used in a similar manner to the ancient swivel, to clear enemy decks, destroy incoming craft, and especially suppression. Keep your head down.
A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.